A single poster could move an entire nation, turning fear into faith and lies into truth. During World War II, one man discovered how to control millions without firing a single shot. But what happens when the artist behind the illusion begins to see the truth behind his own creation? Berlin, January 1933. A struggling commercial artist named Hans Schweitzer, 31 years old, faces financial collapse. Once known for his clever advertising posters, he now sits surrounded by unpaid bills and fading hopes. Germany's economy has disintegrated. Businesses have closed. The demand for art, for persuasion, for optimism has vanished. Schweitzer's training lies in visual persuasion. He knows how to guide the human eye, how to create emotion through color and shape. But in the depths of national despair, that skill feels useless. Until one day, his past work reaches a new audience, the Ministry of Propaganda. Joseph Goebbels, recently appointed to lead the ministry, studies Schweitzer's designs. He sees something powerful in them: clarity, emotion, and control. Goebbels needs artists who can make people believe before they think. Schweitzer is invited to join the ministry with an offer he cannot refuse: stable income, national recognition, and a chance to serve what is called the New Germany. He accepts. At first, it feels like survival, but it is, in truth, the beginning of transformation. Schweitzer's first task seems straightforward: design posters that convert public despair into collective energy. He studies how fear and hope can coexist within a single image. In his sketches, faces look upward in trust, while shadows lurk beneath them. He begins to understand something unsettling: emotions can be engineered. Goebbels encourages the discovery. The ministry's analysts test every poster on small audiences, recording reactions. Results show that fear, followed by reassurance, produces the strongest response. Schweitzer's work is soon displayed across Germany. Within weeks, he becomes one of the ministry's most valued artists. The effect is immediate. Crowds react. Streets echo with slogans drawn from his imagery. Citizens begin repeating phrases they have only seen on his posters. Schweitzer recognizes the influence his art has gained, yet he feels no pride, only confusion. What began as design has become control. Each new project moves further away from commercial simplicity and deeper into psychological strategy. His posters no longer sell products. They sell conviction. They suggest that strength can erase chaos, that unity can restore order. Every design replaces uncertainty with direction, and each one pulls the population closer to a single ideology. Behind closed doors, Schweitzer starts to notice changes within himself. His workdays extend late into the night. He feels driven but uneasy, compelled to perfect every detail even when he doesn't understand why. His wife sees his exhaustion but says nothing. The rewards are real: money, status, importance. But the cost is growing, quietly. He begins to see his posters in unexpected places, on schools, factories, and homes. They no longer represent design. They represent authority. His signature is visible on nearly every major campaign. Ordinary citizens see his images daily, associating them with security, renewal, and loyalty. The effect is measurable. Local reports show rising political engagement wherever his posters appear. For the regime, this is proof of success. For Schweitzer, it becomes a silent warning. He starts to question the role of the artist when art no longer reflects truth. But by now, he is part of something too large to resist. His designs have become instruments of policy, his creativity a component of national machinery. He understands the mechanism clearly now. Fear motivates action. Reassurance maintains obedience. Together, they form a perfect system of control. The ministry expands his responsibilities. New campaigns require stronger emotion, simpler language, and sharper contrasts. The lines between design and deception vanish completely. His art bypasses thought and speaks directly to instinct. He discovers he can guide entire populations without a single spoken word. By the end of that winter, Schweitzer has become one of the most influential artists in Europe, though few know his name. What began as a search for stability has turned into something far more consequential. The quiet crisis that ended his business has awakened a new profession, the art of manipulation. Schweitzer's posters now shape how millions think and feel. His images are no longer harmless works of design. They are blueprints for belief. And within that realization lies the haunting truth. Fear, when painted skillfully enough, can move a nation faster than any speech. It is here, in these early months of 1933, that the propaganda war truly begins. Not with armies or weapons, but with a man holding a paintbrush, discovering that persuasion can be weaponized. By 1934, the propaganda ministry had grown into one of the most organized communication systems in history. Inside its offices, walls were covered not with art, but with data. Charts, reaction notes, and photographs tracked the nation's emotional pulse. Germany was being studied as if it were a single mind waiting to be conditioned. Joseph Goebbels understood that raw speeches and slogans were not enough. Emotion, not logic, moved the masses. He turned to psychology for structure, borrowing techniques from American advertising pioneer Edward Bernays, whose theories on persuasion had already transformed consumer behavior in the United States. Goebbels believed those same principles could reshape an entire society. He formed specialized research units within the ministry. Their task, to measure how imagery, symbols, and colors could alter perception. They studied how long people's eyes rested on a poster, which colors held attention, and which emotions triggered commitment. It was the first large-scale psychological operation of the modern era. Hans Schweitzer became the ministry's key practitioner of this new science. His work bridged art and behavioral control. Every poster he designed now passed through layers of analysis: how it appealed to instinct, how it created belonging, how it framed threat. His designs no longer came from imagination. They came from research. The ministry soon defined what it called the emotional formula. It relied on three components: external threat, internal savior, and visual simplicity. The threat created fear, the savior offered security, and simplicity ensured instant comprehension. Complex ideas were replaced by symbols that could be absorbed in seconds. Schweitzer translated these findings into imagery. His external threats were often shadowed silhouettes or distorted shapes, representing danger without identifying it directly. His saviors were idealized figures: workers with strength, mothers with resolve, soldiers with calm authority. He used color with precision: red for urgency, black for menace, white for purity. The result was immediate recognition and lasting impression. Goebbels measured the results through public surveys and intelligence reports. In one documented test, Schweitzer's new campaign increased enlistment in targeted areas by more than 40%. Crowds gathered at poster sites, debating meanings that were deliberately left ambiguous. The power lay not in the message itself, but in how it made people feel: fearful yet protected, anxious yet obedient. Behind the success, Schweitzer's private doubts deepened. He began keeping personal notes about his methods, observations that mixed pride with guilt. In one entry, he wrote that fear is the most precise instrument of influence, and it leaves no trace of argument. He saw that people didn't remember what a poster said. They remembered how it made them feel. That realization both fascinated and disturbed him. The ministry rewarded him with expanded authority. He now directed a team of younger artists, instructing them in the psychology of design. They operated with almost scientific discipline, using stopwatches to measure viewing times, applying contrast studies, and conducting small field experiments. The line between advertising and propaganda disappeared completely. Outside Germany, foreign observers began to notice the transformation. American diplomats in Berlin sent back reports describing a nation saturated with unified messaging. In Washington, analysts quietly began collecting samples of German posters for study. They noted their simplicity, emotional impact, and relentless repetition. Few realized they were witnessing the emergence of modern psychological warfare. Inside Germany, Schweitzer's reputation continued to rise. He received commendations for visual clarity in the service of the nation. Yet, his private life showed a man consumed by unease. He suffered recurring nightmares in which his images stared back at him. He saw the posters pasted onto the windows of Jewish-owned businesses before they were vandalized. His art had become an instrument of discrimination, and the line between persuasion and persecution was disappearing. At home, his wife noticed his restlessness. He began drinking to quiet his thoughts, staying awake late into the night, sketching compulsively. What he once viewed as professional mastery now felt like moral collapse. But silence was safer than conscience. To question the purpose of his work meant questioning the state itself. Meanwhile, Goebbels' ministry celebrated its success as proof of intellectual victory. They believed propaganda was no longer mere communication, it was behavioral science. Reports circulated claiming the average German citizen had become psychologically unified with national goals. This illusion of consensus gave the government confidence to expand its ambitions beyond its borders. By 1938, Schweitzer's techniques had been refined to perfection. Posters no longer needed explanation. They carried emotional command. Every element served a purpose. Composition, contrast, and even typeface were calculated to bypass rational analysis. He had created what one American observer later called a weapon made of images. Yet for Schweitzer, the success came with unbearable clarity. He understood now that the propaganda system was not built to inform, but to control. It was designed to make people stop thinking, to replace individual judgment with collective emotion. His talent had been transformed into a tool of mass obedience. He began to keep his own archive, sketches, drafts, and research notes documenting the evolution of the ministry's techniques. He claimed it was for reference. In truth, it was a record of how his art had been corrupted. The archive would one day expose the inner workings of a regime that ruled minds before it ruled territory. By the end of the decade, the propaganda ministry had become a state within a state. Nothing reached the public without psychological approval. Films, radio, newspapers, and posters all worked together under Schweitzer's visual strategy. Every message was tested, refined, and released with surgical precision. The entire nation was living inside a narrative, crafted, measured, and maintained. For Schweitzer, this mastery of perception came with one realization that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Truth could be replaced not by lies, but by feelings strong enough to make truth irrelevant. By the spring of 1938, Hans Schweitzer's success had made him indispensable to the Ministry of Propaganda. His designs had reshaped the visual identity of an entire nation. Across Germany, citizens recognized his work instantly, even if they never knew his name. His posters had become the background of daily life, quietly defining what people should fear, admire, and obey. That year, a new order reached his desk, one that would test every fragment of conscience he had left. The ministry demanded a campaign that would unite the population by isolating a common enemy from within. The target, Germany's Jewish citizens. Joseph Goebbels called it the enemy within. The directive was blunt. Make the public see their neighbors not as people, but as threats. Schweitzer hesitated for the first time in his career. He understood the power of imagery better than anyone else. He knew this assignment would not only shape opinion, it would destroy empathy. But refusal meant professional ruin, and possibly worse. The ministry's network of surveillance was known for identifying even subtle dissent. Schweitzer's hesitation could be interpreted as disloyalty. Within days, he made his choice. He continued the work. The assignment began like any other: research, sketches, testing. Yet this time, the subject matter was deeply personal. Schweitzer studied human expressions for signs of unease and suspicion. He combined them into visual metaphors that implied deceit, greed, or corruption, without ever stating it directly. The propaganda had to appear truthful, built on suggestion rather than accusation. The first series of posters appeared in major German cities within weeks. They portrayed contrast: honest German families on one side, shadowed figures on the other. The message was unmistakable even without words. Within days, observers noted shifts in public behavior. Ordinary citizens began avoiding certain shops, changing routes to work, or repeating new slogans that spread through the press and radio. The campaign was working exactly as designed. The ministry recorded its success meticulously. Reports detailed rising attendance at nationalist rallies and reduced sympathy for Jewish families. Internal documents described the posters as the most effective emotional unifier produced to date. Schweitzer's visual system, once used to inspire, was now weaponized to divide. In his private notebook, he described the experience in a few words: "We have taught people to fear faces." American observers stationed in Europe began to notice the growing sophistication of these campaigns. Analysts in the U.S. Embassy collected samples and sent them back to Washington. Intelligence notes described how Germany had turned advertising into emotional engineering. For the first time, American psychologists began referring to German propaganda as applied behavioral science. Inside Germany, Schweitzer could no longer escape what he had built. Traveling through Berlin, he saw his posters on every wall. Even his old neighborhood was filled with them. A bakery once owned by a family he knew now displayed one of his designs in the window, placed there not by choice, but by pressure. When he passed, people looked away. The power of his own imagery now isolated him from those who once called him a friend. The results of the campaign were undeniable. Government surveys recorded a dramatic decline in tolerance. Local councils reported spontaneous demonstrations that required no direct instruction. Propaganda had achieved what speeches alone could not. It had turned emotion into action. Schweitzer's internal conflict grew heavier with each passing month. He destroyed early drafts of his next series, terrified that even unfinished sketches could be used for more campaigns. But the ministry no longer required his consent. Assistants trained under him continued his work, applying his methods to new subjects. His visual formula, fear and reassurance, had become self-replicating. As the campaigns intensified, he began noticing something else. His techniques were spreading beyond Germany's borders. Italian and Japanese officials visited the ministry, studying its methods. Foreign artists learned from his principles of color, composition, and suggestion. Schweitzer realized his inventions were shaping propaganda worldwide. What he had started as professional design had become a global psychological model. Yet for all its influence, he found no pride in it. His creative control had vanished. Each new commission arrived with stricter ideological requirements. Every line, color, and symbol now carried political approval. He was no longer creating art. He was manufacturing obedience. In late 1938, he traveled to his hometown for the first time in years. The small train station bore a poster of his own design, one of the Enemy Within series. He walked past it, pretending not to notice. But the sight stayed with him, the unmistakable feeling that his work had consumed the place that once felt like home. The transformation of public space was total. Posters lined every street. Loudspeakers repeated coordinated messages. Newspapers echoed visual motifs from Schweitzer's designs. The ministry's system had achieved complete integration of media and emotion. Every citizen lived inside a continuous flow of controlled perception. By 1939, foreign intelligence analysts concluded that Germany had created the first total propaganda state. and at the heart of it stood Schweitzer's visual psychology, a precise mechanism for shaping fear and loyalty. Inside the ministry, Goebbels praised the campaign as a masterpiece of psychological mobilization. He called it a silent war, won without firing a shot. The phrase would later appear in internal communications describing the model for all future operations. For Schweitzer, that description marked the point of no return. He had turned fear into the foundation of a nation's belief system. The success of his work made him indispensable and trapped. He could no longer leave, and he could no longer look away. His personal records from that year grew shorter, almost clinical. He stopped writing reflections and began listing only data: design parameters, audience reactions, color outcomes. Emotion was replaced by analysis, as if distancing himself from responsibility. But deep down, he knew the damage was irreversible. He had learned that once fear takes hold, it requires no further guidance. It perpetuates itself. The campaign had achieved its goal too effectively. The public no longer needed persuasion. It now believed instinctively. That spring marked the final phase of Schweitzer's transformation, from artist to architect of emotional control. The quiet man who once painted to survive had built one of the most influential psychological weapons of the 20th century. By the summer of 1939, his posters would serve a new purpose. The ministry began shifting focus toward external enemies. The imagery of internal threat evolved seamlessly into the imagery of war. The same formulas, fear, savior, simplicity, would soon march across Europe. And as the world prepared for open conflict, Hans Schweitzer understood, perhaps more than anyone else, that the first victory of the coming war had already been won, not on battlefields, but in the minds of millions. By the end of 1939, the German propaganda system had achieved full operational strength. While the world watched armies move across borders, another kind of invasion was already underway, a campaign of the mind. The Ministry of Propaganda had built an empire not of territories but of emotions, and it was working. When American diplomats began analyzing reports from Europe, they noticed a pattern. Public morale in Germany remained unshaken, despite food shortages, conscription, and military loss. The explanation lay not in censorship alone, but in something deeper: a controlled psychological environment. The United States realized that the next war would not only be fought with weapons, it would be fought with perception. In Washington, a newly established group within the U.S. Office of War Information began gathering evidence. They studied confiscated posters, films, and transcripts. They identified a single recurring artistic style: sharp contrasts, symbolic figures, minimal text. It matched the work of one man, Hans Schweitzer. Intelligence analysts referred to him informally as the visual engineer. His name appeared repeatedly in captured documents. His campaigns had measurable impact: increased enlistment, reduced dissent, and consistent belief in ultimate victory. To American observers, it was proof that Germany had turned art into a weapon system. The discovery forced a moral and strategic question inside the American government. If propaganda could mobilize a nation toward destruction, could it also be used to defend freedom? The U.S. did not yet have a centralized propaganda apparatus, but the need became undeniable. Psychological warfare was now recognized as a decisive front. American strategists began developing their own methods, rooted not in fear, but in conviction. In 1940, prominent artist Ben Shahn was quietly approached by federal officials. Shahn had built his reputation illustrating the struggles of working Americans during the Great Depression. His visual language was empathetic, not coercive. Officials believed he could translate that empathy into a communication strategy that matched Germany's intensity, but not its manipulation. Shahn was introduced to psychological studies of German media collected by analysts. They outlined the methods Schweitzer had perfected: repetition, contrast, and emotional conditioning. American teams studied these elements carefully, not to imitate them, but to understand their mechanics. Their conclusion was clear. Fear created obedience, but hope built endurance. This became the foundation of the American counter-propaganda philosophy. Instead of controlling minds, it would appeal to conscience. Instead of demanding loyalty, it would remind people what they were protecting. The decision was not merely moral, it was strategic. Analysts believed that democracy could not sustain itself through fear without eventually resembling the systems it opposed. Thus began the quiet war between two psychological empires, one built on fear of loss, the other on faith in possibility. To the Germans, propaganda was an exact science: measure, test, deploy. To the Americans, it became a moral experiment: prove that truth could compete with lies if told with enough clarity and conviction. Ben Shah's team began producing posters emphasizing unity, family, and perseverance. Soldiers were portrayed not as symbols of power, but as protectors of home and principle. American messaging spoke less about the enemy and more about the meaning of the fight. Where German posters shouted certainty, American designs whispered resilience. Intelligence reports soon revealed how profoundly different the approaches were. In Germany, fear generated instant reaction, but required constant reinforcement. In America, hope inspired slower responses but created steady participation. Each nation had discovered its own psychological rhythm. Within military analysis groups, the debate turned academic. Psychologists compared the two systems like rival scientific models. Which emotion, fear or hope, produced the stronger soldier, the more loyal citizen, the longer endurance? No one had a definitive answer. But as the war expanded, data began to accumulate. German propaganda campaigns required escalating levels of intensity to maintain control. Each new loss forced larger lies. In contrast, American campaigns grew stronger as they aligned with truth. When U.S. soldiers returned from early victories, their stories confirmed the promises made in posters. Authenticity, not illusion, became the key advantage. For Hans Schweitzer, still working inside Berlin, none of this was visible yet. He continued receiving orders, unaware that across the ocean, a group of American artists and psychologists were studying his methods line by line. To them, he was not a villain, but a case study, a warning of what happened when talent served ideology instead of humanity. Inside the U.S. Office of War Information, Schweitzer's posters were dissected like scientific specimens. Analysts noted how fear could bypass reason, how certain shapes and contrasts created anxiety even without text. They realized the same techniques could be redirected, used not to instill terror, but to evoke courage. The weapon could be inverted. This became the defining difference between the two propaganda systems. German propaganda demanded compliance. American propaganda invited participation. By late 1941, with the U.S. formally entering the war, the American information campaign gained full momentum. Radio programs, newsreels, and posters flooded the country with messages that combined pride, sacrifice, and belonging. The tone was firm but human. The goal was not control. It was cohesion. Across the Atlantic, Schweitzer's latest designs continued to glorify power while concealing loss. The gap between imagery and reality widened with each passing month. German citizens still believed victory was near, while Allied intelligence already knew the truth. Propaganda had become both shield and trap, protecting morale while blinding those inside it. By 1942, American psychological units began coordinated counter-broadcasts into Europe. Leaflets, radio shows, and visual messages challenged German narratives directly, using real evidence: photographs, eyewitness reports, and simple statistics. The technique was subtle but effective. When truth entered the propaganda battlefield, illusion began to fracture. American analysts later concluded that fear-based systems could dominate quickly but decayed under pressure. Hope-based systems moved slowly, but survived contact with reality. This finding became one of the most important lessons of wartime psychology. Within Germany, Schweitzer's influence began to shift. The ministry demanded stronger, more desperate imagery as defeats mounted. His early precision was replaced by urgency. His art no longer inspired confidence. It tried to suppress panic. He had become a craftsman repairing a machine that could no longer function. Yet in a quiet office thousands of miles away, his name remained on American watch lists. His posters were pinned on classroom walls at U.S. training schools, not as inspiration, but as instruction. Every American propaganda officer studied his work to understand its logic and its danger. The propaganda war had become a mirror, each side studying the other to understand its own mind. For Germany, it was about maintaining illusion. For America, it was about defending belief. And in that unseen conflict of words and images, the fate of morale across two continents hung in balance. Winter 1942, the German front in the east has reached Stalingrad. Inside Germany, the Ministry of Propaganda continues to promise inevitable victory. Posters still show soldiers advancing with confidence. Banners still proclaim triumph. Yet the truth on the ground is devastating. Entire divisions are encircled, supply lines cut, and communication fading. Reality and propaganda have begun to separate. In Berlin, Hans Schweitzer receives new instructions. His task: create imagery that explains the disaster without acknowledging defeat. The ministry wants morale preserved, faith sustained. Schweitzer knows it cannot be done. His art once reflected the illusion of control. Now it must disguise collapse. He studies reports. From the front, coded summaries filled with losses, described as strategic withdrawals. Goebbels demands a new campaign built around endurance and sacrifice. The message must say, Germany bends, but does not break. Schweitzer begins to design posters showing stoic faces against endless snow, men standing firm in impossible conditions. The images are powerful, but even he can see the difference. These are not symbols of strength. They are symbols of denial. As the posters appear across cities, whispers begin spreading through the population. Families receive telegrams about soldiers who never returned. The once mighty machinery of propaganda begins to strain against the weight of truth. For the first time, citizens start comparing official slogans with their lived reality. The emotional unity Schweitzer once engineered is unraveling. He feels it too. The ministry corridors, once filled with confidence, now echo with tension. Teams work longer hours, producing more posters, more broadcasts, more words to hold back disbelief. Yet the more they communicate, the less they convince. Fear no longer motivates. Exhaustion has taken its place. One evening, Schweitzer receives a personal message. His younger brother, serving on the Eastern Front, has died in the siege. The notice is written in the same formal tone Schweitzer himself once designed for casualty announcements. The phrases, the layout, the patriotic signature, it is all his work. The realization hits him with devastating clarity. His art has become the language of loss. He sits alone at his desk, staring at the document. Every word feels mechanical, stripped of humanity. The system he helped create now delivers grief in perfect typography. For the first time, he sees propaganda not as persuasion, but as insulation, a barrier between people and truth. In the weeks that follow, Schweitzer stops attending meetings. He claims illness. His superiors suspect fatigue but leave him undisturbed. He spends hours reviewing his earlier designs, searching for the exact point when persuasion turned into deception. He cannot find it. The transition had been too gradual, too seamless. Meanwhile, American intelligence intercepts internal German communications. Reports describe declining public morale and growing mistrust in official statements. Analysts record a pattern. As propaganda grows louder, belief grows weaker. The illusion of control is collapsing from within. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Office of War Information recognizes a strategic opportunity. They shift their focus from domestic morale to international influence. New campaigns directly confront German messaging. Leaflets dropped over enemy lines show photographs from the front, destroyed tanks, captured soldiers, real casualties. Each image is paired with a copy of a German poster promising victory. The contrast is undeniable. This new approach, truth against illusion, proves devastatingly effective. Captured reports reveal that many German soldiers begin doubting official briefings after seeing the leaflets. The propaganda machine, once Germany's greatest strength, is now undermined by its own overconfidence. Inside Berlin, Goebbels reacts with fury. He orders Schweitzer's department to counter the Allied material with renewed emotional vigor. The instruction is simple: overwhelm facts with feeling. The ministry launches another series of posters emphasizing loyalty and destiny. But the visual power that once moved millions now fails to connect. Reality has become too visible. Schweitzer, meanwhile, has reached his limit. He cannot bring himself to create new imagery. When he finally returns to his studio, he sits before a blank canvas for hours, unable to begin. His assistants wait in silence. The man who once controlled the emotional temperature of a nation can no longer summon conviction. He begins to understand that propaganda, like any illusion, depends on distance from reality. Once truth becomes visible, the image collapses. Germany's military defeats have pierced the screen he spent years constructing. And through that tear, everyone can now see the truth. American analysts continue monitoring German morale through captured diaries and intercepted letters. The findings confirm a psychological shift. Where propaganda once inspired unity, it now provokes bitterness. Citizens feel betrayed by promises that never matched experience. The ministry's greatest weapon has become its liability. Within weeks, internal documents note declining compliance in civilian labor programs and reduced attendance at rallies. Propaganda, once a unifying force, has turned into noise. For Schweitzer, the collapse is personal as well as national. The death of his brother and the disintegration of his work leave him hollow. He withdraws from public life, producing only minimal revisions to existing designs. When summoned by superiors, he claims exhaustion, avoiding confrontation. But in his private writings, he admits the truth. I built the mirror that now reflects our ruin. By 1943, the American strategy has evolved even further. Their new campaigns highlight verified facts and visual honesty. Posters show returning soldiers, real industrial workers, authentic families. Every image connects effort to outcome. Hope becomes evidence, not illusion. And that difference, subtle but decisive, begins shifting the global perception of the war. Inside Germany, Schweitzer's posters remain on the walls, but they no longer command attention. People walk past them without looking. The colors have faded. The slogans feel empty. The magic has evaporated. The Ministry of Propaganda still operates, but its influence has cracked beyond repair. Citizens listen secretly to Allied radio broadcasts for information. Photographs smuggled from the front circulate quietly among families. The truth, once hidden beneath Schweitzer's designs, is reclaiming the public imagination. By the end of 1942, the turning point is complete. The visual weapon that once controlled a nation has lost its power. Schweitzer, drained and disillusioned, retreats into isolation. The regime that once depended on his images now demands miracles he can no longer deliver. And yet, even as the propaganda machine begins to fail, its legacy continues to operate in the minds of millions. Proof that emotional manipulation, once unleashed, does not vanish easily. For America, this moment becomes confirmation of a principle that will shape its entire information strategy. Truth, when consistent, outlasts fear. For Schweitzer, it becomes something darker. He learns that once a lie takes visual form, it never fully disappears. It lingers, echoing through memory, long after belief has died. By 1943, the tone of German propaganda had changed. What once projected confidence now reeked of desperation. Posters shouted louder, colors grew harsher, and slogans turned frantic. The imagery no longer inspired, it pleaded. The Ministry of Propaganda demanded miracles from an artist who no longer believed in the message. Hans Schweitzer, once the architect of Germany's visual dominance, had become a man painting illusions for a crumbling empire. His studio, once orderly and alive with precision, now felt like a command post under siege. Every new commission arrived marked urgent. Every instruction demanded reassurance the nation no longer felt. Joseph Goebbels intensified control over every department. His new directive was absolute. Germany must appear unbroken, even in ruin. Schweitzer was ordered to create a series of posters depicting the consequences of defeat. Dark, apocalyptic visions meant to terrify civilians into endurance. The message was clear. Surrender meant extinction. Resistance meant survival. Schweitzer obeyed, but without conviction. His new posters showed burning cities and faceless armies approaching from shadows. They used distorted angles and violent contrast, images designed to invoke panic rather than pride. The artistry was still there, but the soul was gone. Even within the ministry, whispers began circulating that the once celebrated artist had lost his touch. American intelligence, intercepting German broadcasts, quickly recognized the tonal shift. Analysts noted that fear-based propaganda had become so extreme it was beginning to backfire. Reports from occupied territories revealed civilians reacting with fatigue rather than loyalty. The constant warnings and threats were eroding trust, not strengthening it. What had once controlled emotion now only reminded people of how much they had lost. Meanwhile, Allied propaganda grew stronger. Leaflets dropped from the sky in German towns carried simple, verifiable truths, photographs of destroyed units, evidence of Allied victories, promises of humane treatment for surrendering soldiers. American psychological teams coordinated every message with the precision Schweitzer once prided himself on. The difference was honesty. Facts had become a weapon, and Germany's illusions were no match for reality. By mid-1944, Schweitzer's life had shrunk to the confines of his studio. He rarely spoke, rarely left. His assistants worked in silence, copying his older styles for new campaigns. The ministry continued to demand output, but Schweitzer himself was detached, working mechanically, without emotion. He had seen what his art could do, and he no longer wanted to feel responsible for it. In one surviving note from this period, he wrote, "Propaganda without truth is only noise, and noise cannot hold a nation together." The world outside his studio confirmed that truth daily. Air raids destroyed cities faster than posters could promise safety. Families fled to shelters beneath walls covered with his own designs. Civilians who once saluted his images now used them as kindling or covered them with Allied leaflets. His art, once a symbol of control, had become a backdrop for collapse. The ministry still reported positive morale indicators, but Goebbels's tone in internal memos revealed panic. He ordered new designs every week, posters proclaiming final victory, posters glorifying fallen soldiers, posters depicting the invincibility of faith. None worked. The population had stopped believing. Fear, once Schweitzer's most effective tool, had reached its limit. Across the Atlantic, American and British intelligence units expanded their psychological operations. Leaflets were printed by the millions. Loudspeakers along battlefronts delivered carefully scripted messages to German troops, emphasizing truth and compassion rather than threats. Allied radio broadcasts reached deep into Germany, countering Schweitzer's visual world with simple words. The war is ending. Save what remains. By now, even German officers began to notice the difference. Many secretly tuned to Allied radio for updates they could trust. Schweitzer's once omnipresent posters still appeared on public walls, but people passed them without reaction. The images had lost authority. The artist had lost faith. and the regime was running on fear alone. In late 1944, Schweitzer was summoned by Goebbels personally. The minister, visibly exhausted but still relentless, demanded one final series: images. To convince civilians that the war was still winnable, Schweitzer complied mechanically, producing exaggerated scenes of victory that even Goebbels found difficult to defend. When one of his new designs reached the front lines, soldiers reportedly laughed. The illusion had finally broken. The truth had overtaken the image. Allied intelligence documented this moment carefully. Captured German diaries described widespread cynicism toward official propaganda. Phrases like, "Nothing they say matters anymore," appeared frequently. Analysts concluded that the propaganda system, once the engine of national unity, had reversed itself. It now accelerated disillusionment. By early 1945, Schweitzer's once powerful imagery had vanished from the streets. Bombing raids and retreating armies left cities without walls to post on. His posters were torn, burned, or buried under rubble. The Ministry of Propaganda continued, operating out of bunkers, still producing materials few would ever see. Schweitzer kept working because he had nothing else left. He produced sketches, unfinished drafts, and symbolic concepts that no longer carried the illusion of victory. His final known piece, never released publicly, showed an empty frame surrounded by broken tools. It was titled, "The End of Vision." When Allied forces advanced into Germany, they began uncovering archives of the propaganda ministry. Thousands of files revealed the depth of its psychological operations. Among them, American officers found Schweitzer's name again and again, listed beside effectiveness reports, testing data, and production orders. He was no longer just an artist. He was evidence. Inside his studio, Allied troops discovered hundreds of unfinished designs pinned to the walls. Many depicted a Germany that no longer existed. Cities unbombed, soldiers triumphant, families smiling. The illusion remained intact on paper, though reality had already erased it. The propaganda war had reached its inevitable conclusion. Fear, once weaponized so precisely, had turned inward. It consumed the regime that created it and the artist who perfected it. Schweitzer's work no longer shaped minds. It documented the psychology of collapse. In contrast, American propaganda reached its peak effectiveness during the same period. Radio broadcasts in Germany's final months urged surrender, offering proof rather than promises. Photographs of captured cities, humane treatment of prisoners, and the visible advance of Allied troops made denial impossible. The truth became self-evident, and it broke the final barrier of disbelief. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin, propaganda on both sides had completed its arc. Germany's system ended in silence. America's continued as a symbol of endurance and honesty. The psychological war had been won not by those who could deceive best, but by those who could tell the truth longest. For Hans Schweitzer, there was nothing left to design. His nation had collapsed. His ministry was in ruins. And his art, once his pride, had become his confession. April 1945. Berlin is collapsing. Government ministries operate from basements and shattered buildings. Communications are sporadic, commands delayed, faith extinguished. Amid the ruins, Allied forces advance through a city that once believed itself indestructible. In a small studio near the city center, Hans Schweitzer remains behind. The walls around him are covered with sketches and unfinished posters. His final designs show nothing triumphant, only faces staring into empty space. On his desk are notebooks filled with calculations, diagrams, and annotations about visual psychology. They are records of everything he learned and everything he destroyed. When American troops enter Berlin, Schweitzer makes no attempt to flee. He is found sitting quietly, surrounded by his own work. He offers no resistance, no excuses. The soldiers search the room and discover hundreds of detailed notes documenting the inner machinery of propaganda, testing data, audience analysis, and psychological observations. Each page is a map of how emotion was turned into control. The evidence is overwhelming. His notebooks outline years of systematic emotional engineering, describing the use of color, rhythm, and repetition to alter public perception. Schweitzer has preserved it all, not to protect himself, but as if to leave behind a confession written in diagrams. He is taken into custody and transferred to an American intelligence unit responsible for analyzing captured propaganda materials. The officer assigned to interview him is Major Robert Walsh, a specialist in psychological warfare. Walsh has studied Schweitzer's work for years without ever expecting to meet the man behind it. During the first session, Walsh recognizes Schweitzer's precision immediately. The artist speaks without hesitation, describing his methods like a scientist explaining an experiment. He outlines how every campaign began with research, how emotional triggers were measured, and how symbols were tested for effect. There is no denial, only methodical detail. For American analysts, it is a revelation. Schweitzer's testimony confirms what intelligence suspected but could not prove: that Germany's propaganda was not random or instinctive, but an organized psychological operation on a national scale. His work becomes a case study in how fear can be quantified and mass-produced. Walsh records everything. Transcripts describe Schweitzer explaining that fear alone was never enough. It needed structure, rhythm, and resolution. Fear without hope, he says, creates paralysis. Fear with hope creates obedience. The phrase becomes one of the most cited in post-war intelligence reports. As the sessions continue, the tone shifts. Schweitzer begins to reflect, not just explain. He admits that he once believed art could remain neutral. That belief, he says, was his greatest error. His work did not serve ideas, it replaced them. The regime used his imagery to fill silence where conscience should have spoken. Each poster became a piece of armor around a fragile truth. Walsh listens carefully, but remains professional. He knows that regret cannot rewrite evidence. Schweitzer's designs are linked to documented social changes, enlistment surges, shifts in public opinion, and behavioral data proving measurable influence. His art helped sustain one of the most destructive ideologies of the century. Yet in his demeanor, Walsh sees something unexpected: remorse that feels genuine. American psychologists attend the interrogations, documenting every statement. They analyze Schweitzer's notes and compile them into classified reports. The material becomes essential reading for researchers studying how democratic societies might resist future manipulation. His insights reveal both the danger and the potential of persuasion. Schweitzer is never charged with war crimes. His role, though significant, is categorized as psychological collaboration rather than direct participation in violence. Still, his name becomes a quiet presence in classified archives, a man whose intellect shaped one of history's most effective instruments of deception. Major Walsh writes his final report months later. In it, he describes Schweitzer as a technician of emotion who discovered too late that precision without conscience leads inevitably to destruction. The report concludes that understanding propaganda's mechanics is not enough. It must be anchored in moral responsibility. The line between persuasion and manipulation, it states, is measured not by skill, but by purpose. After the interrogation period, Schweitzer is released under restricted supervision. He is forbidden from working in media or public design. Instead, he is directed to assist American analysts in cataloging propaganda materials for historical record. For months, he helps document his own work, labeling files, identifying campaigns, and verifying data. It is a strange kind of self-archaeology, an artist helping dismantle the very system he built. The American team learns more from Schweitzer's quiet explanations than from any captured directive. He shows how even the smallest design choices carried meaning, how the tilt of a face could imply trust, how a shadow could generate unease, how repetition could normalize belief. Every visual instinct he describes becomes a cautionary lesson. When the work ends, Schweitzer is moved to a temporary settlement for civilians cleared of major offenses. He lives alone, seldom speaking of the past. Those who meet him later describe a man who seems perpetually distant, as if still haunted by the soundless echoes of his own designs. In America, Schweitzer's testimony becomes restricted material. Portions of it are studied by universities, military academies, and intelligence schools. His diagrams of emotional conditioning influence early research in propaganda resistance and public communication ethics. Few know his name, but his shadow lingers over every discussion of how media can shape society. Major Walsh continues his research long after the war. In lectures, he refers to Schweitzer only as the artist who measured fear. He tells his students that propaganda's greatest danger lies not in falsehood itself, but in the comfort it offers. Lies, he explains, do not need to convince. They only need to replace uncertainty with clarity. For Hans Schweitzer, the reckoning is complete. He has faced no tribunal, no sentence, yet he remains imprisoned by memory. His notebooks, taken as evidence, become part of a classified archive, an unspoken monument to how ordinary talent, when separated from ethics, can shape extraordinary harm. The war has ended, but its lessons are only beginning. Schweitzer's art no longer commands obedience. Instead, it stands as silent testimony to a truth that both sides now understand. In modern warfare, victory and destruction begin with what people choose to believe. In the months following Germany's surrender, American intelligence teams worked tirelessly to catalog the psychological infrastructure of the Nazi regime. Thousands of posters, films, and documents were gathered, classified, and analyzed. Among these records, the most studied materials were those bearing the signature of Hans Schweitzer. His notebooks, sketches, and personal writings revealed how emotion could be turned into architecture, how fear could be built, maintained, and deployed like a weapon. For American experts, this discovery was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The reports from the Office of War Information and the Army Psychological Warfare Division made one fact undeniable. Propaganda had evolved into a form of applied science. It could direct thought, control sentiment, and move entire populations without physical force. The victory over Germany had exposed not just a military threat, but a philosophical one. Analysts in Washington pored over Schweitzer's materials line by line. They studied his color theories, his audience tests, his emotional mapping. One report described his system as a machine for turning feeling into obedience. Another concluded that the danger of such precision was not limited to dictatorships. Democracies, too, could misuse it if conscience failed. The intelligence briefings grew somber. America had won the war of arms, but now faced a question of ethics. Could truth itself be manipulated if presented beautifully enough? Could a free nation remain honest once it understood how easily minds could be guided? These questions defined the post-war psychological study of communication. American universities partnered with the government to research propaganda's mechanics, not to imitate it, but to inoculate against it. Schweitzer's captured notebooks became reference material in early experiments on public perception. His diagrams, stripped of ideology, served as warnings. Each arrow, each pattern, each ratio of color and form showed how persuasion could become control. In parallel, the American propaganda campaign that had helped win the war was also under review. Analysts compared it to Germany's system, measuring not only results, but moral consequences. They found that while both used emotional appeal, the American method had sustained credibility because it remained anchored in truth. Posters showing families reunited, soldiers returning, and communities rebuilding had proven more resilient than fear-based messages. One intelligence summary phrased it simply, "Germany's promises collapsed. Ours endured." The data confirmed what wartime psychologists had suspected. Fear can compel action quickly, but hope sustains it longer. German propaganda achieved temporary control. American propaganda achieved enduring belief. The difference lay in moral foundation, not visual skill. Statistics from the final years of the war reinforced this conclusion. German recruitment required continuous psychological reinforcement. American enlistment remained steady without coercion. German morale plummeted as illusions broke. American morale endured through hardship because it was built on transparency and shared purpose. For U.S. policymakers, this realization carried enormous significance. It proved that democracy did not need to mimic tyranny to win against it. Honesty, though slower, had greater endurance. A free society could fight a psychological war without abandoning its principles. Still, the findings were sobering. Schweitzer's data revealed just how fragile human judgment could be. His notes described how repetition created acceptance, how emotional rhythm replaced logic, how small visual cues could bypass awareness. Reading his work felt like looking into a mirror that reflected democracy's own vulnerabilities. In private discussions, American officials debated how much of this knowledge should be used. Some argued it could strengthen education and media literacy. Others feared it might tempt future governments toward subtle manipulation. The conclusion was cautious but clear. Understanding propaganda was essential, but wielding it demanded restraint. The philosophical outcome of these studies was summarized in a single intelligence memorandum. Democracy survives not by controlling thought, but by preparing minds to resist control. In the years that followed, these insights shaped the foundation of post-war communication policy. Federal regulations began addressing honesty in advertising and political messaging. The principles derived from studying Schweitzer's methods influenced ethical standards across journalism, education, and public broadcasting. His lessons, though born of manipulation, became instruments of awareness. American universities introduced new courses in media psychology and public persuasion, often citing the wartime research as their origin. Professors warned students that the line between education and propaganda could vanish when emotion replaced evidence. Schweitzer's work, though never publicly credited, was the silent case study behind many of these warnings. Major Robert Walsh, now retired from intelligence service, was invited to deliver lectures on psychological warfare at military academies. In each talk, he referred to Schweitzer's case without using his name. He described him as the man who proved that art without morality becomes ideology. His presentations included slides comparing German and American wartime posters. The same colors, the same visual precision, but entirely different purposes. The point was clear. The message matters as much as the method. Publicly, America celebrated its victory as a triumph of principle. Privately, its thinkers acknowledged how close the moral contest had been. They understood that in a different context, with weaker ethical restraint, the same persuasive tools could easily serve oppression instead of freedom. The psychological war had revealed something larger than national rivalry. It had exposed the architecture of human belief. It proved that perception could be guided, but also that integrity could endure even in an age of manipulation. By the late 1940s, the classified analysis of German propaganda was partially declassified for academic use. Researchers examined how societies could build immunity to emotional distortion. They found that awareness, knowing how persuasion works, was the strongest defense. Education, transparency, and open debate became the tools of democracy's self-protection. In this way, the war's psychological front produced an unexpected legacy. It turned the study of propaganda into the study of freedom itself. Every diagram Schweitzer drew, every formula for fear he recorded, now served an opposite purpose: to teach how to recognize the instruments of control before they could be used again. For the United States, the ultimate victory of the propaganda war was not only military or political, it was philosophical. It proved that a nation could face the darkest science of manipulation and still emerge with its values intact. Hope had triumphed, not because it was louder, but because it was true. And for those who studied the captured archives, one conclusion remained constant across every report, every lecture, and every generation of analysts that followed. The greatest strength of democracy is its willingness to question its own truth.